Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Navigating the Regulatory Landscape in Clinical Trials in 2024. My name is Aisha Rashid and I will be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speaker. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speaker throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. We also have a handout available for this presentation. You may download it through the Handouts tab in your control panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank CRIO, who developed the content for this presentation. CRIO offers an integrated eSource EDC platform with a built-in network of more than 2,000 sites that use CRIO eSource every day. The CRIO platform embeds real-time alert logic to build quality and compliance at point of capture. Data is captured once by the site and not re-entered into an EDC system. This delivery model improves protocol compliance, reduces time to market, lowers audit risk, and decreases overhead costs. And now it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for today's event. As the Director of Security, Corporate QA and Compliance, Marc Wartenberger is leading the corporate security, quality, and compliance initiatives at CRIO. Additionally, he is serving as CRIO's Data Protection Officer. Prior to CRIO, Marc was leading the quality assurance efforts at Snap IoT, now part of LabCorp Drug Development. Before Snap IoT, Marc was a key member of the Corporate Compliance and QA group at Clinical Inc. from 2012 to 2021 and served as its Data Protection Officer from 2018 to 2021. And now, without further ado, I'd like to pass over the mic and the stage to our speaker. Marc, you may begin when ready.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Just quick check. Can you see my screen? Yes, that is wonderful. Let's get right to it. We got an action-packed agenda. Thank you all for taking the time out of your busy Wednesdays to be with me for the next hour or so to talk about regulations. That is everyone's favorite topic in clinical trials. Thank you so much, Aisha, for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm the head of security, corporate QA, and compliance at CRIO. Also as serve as a data protection officer. And if you are in and around the clinical trial space, you may have seen my friendly face at the various conferences and industry events around the world, from India to the United States and Europe. So without further ado, this is our agenda for today. And before we jump right in, I believe we have two questions that Aisha will share with the audience now.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of poll questions for our audience to participate in before we kickstart the presentation. And let's take a look at the first question. And this question is asking, what is your current role? So we'd like to just assess our audience and get a feel for our demographics here today. So the options that you can choose from include regulatory or QA, clinical operations for project management, data science, biostatistics, PI site staff, or other. So once again, the question is, what is your current role? And please take a moment to select from one of the following options. Once again, the question is, what is your current role? And you may select from any one of the following options. All right, I can see the votes are coming in, so thank you so much for your participation. We greatly appreciate it. And I'll close up the poll in just a few moments, and then we'll take a look at the results. All right, I'll give our audience just a couple of more seconds to get their votes in before I close the poll. And once again, we'd like to know what your current role is at your organization. Okay, it looks like most of our audience has voted. So once again, thank you so much for doing so. I'm going to close up the poll and let's take a look at the results. All right, so 39% of the audience responded that they're in regulatory QA, 30% are in clinical operations, project management, 5% in data management, data science, biostatistics, 5% responded PI site staff, and 22% responded other. All right, thank you so much for voting in for that poll question. And now we have another poll question coming up after that one. And let's take a look at this one. So for this poll question, we'd like to know what type of organization do you work for? And please select from one of the following options: site, sponsor, CRO, technology, or other. Once again, what type of organization do you work for? And so please take a moment to select from one of the following options. And like before, when I close up the poll, I will share the results. And we'll go from there. Okay, I see that the majority of our audience has voted. So once again, thank you so much for doing so. I'm going to close up the poll and let's take a look at the results and where our audience is. Okay, so 25% responded site, 29% for sponsor, 22% for CRO, 9% are in technology, and 15% responded other. Once again, thank you very much to our audience for participating in those poll questions. Mark, it's back to you.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, you have not missed out. You're at the right webinar for today. We'll have something for everyone, from technology vendors to sites, sponsors, CROs, as well as everyone else that needs to know about the latest and greatest when it comes to regulations and guidances from the FDA and others. So let's dive right on in. The first document that we're going to dive in is the draft guidance that was released in April 22 for diversity plans to improve enrollment of participants from underrepresented racial and ethnic populations. Obviously, the diversity is and inclusion is a big talking point within the clinical trials world right now, and this is the FDA's attempt to shed a little bit more light into what the expectations are to help increase diversity in clinical trials. So before we do that, how did we get here? The first attempt was really in 2016. That was the guidance that was released. It was called Collection of Race and Ethnicity Data in Clinical Trials. And now, 6 years later, we are at the diversity plan guidance, and it really includes additional details on what should be part of a race and ethnicity diversity plan. So a couple elements that are really key to this guidance. One is when a race and ethnicity diversity plan is recommended, timelines and process for submission, and then also what should be in it. So the FDA makes it very clear when a diversity plan is recommended. Here's a list of applications that they list as part of the guidance, right? Everything from 510K, NDAs, BLAs, IDE, you name it. If it's part of this list, a diversity plan is recommended. So what does that mean? Okay, we're looking to put together a 510K. What do we do? So for drugs, sponsors, for drugs, sponsors should put the plan together to the relevant IND application as soon as practicable during drug development, but no later than the EOP2 meeting. And then for devices, sponsors should submit their plan as part of the investigational plan included in the IDE application. So the best guidance we can give here is to put that plan together as soon as possible and seek feedback from the FDA around your plan. So what's in this plan, right? We need to look at enrollment goals for that are aligned with the study objectives. That's really important. We have to consider any potential for disparities. Right? We need to look at existing data for potential differences in safety or effectiveness due to race or ethnicity. We need to make sure that we not just collect diversity data, but also collect diverse data, right? Pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic, and pharmacogenomic data that from a diverse population as it's relevant to the drug. We need to include and factor in the device performance. That's really important because, as we all know, some of the simplest examples would be skin pigmentation for pulse oximeters. That's obviously something that can impact the measurement, and that needs to be considered in those plans as well. We need to make sure that we analyze for differential effects. To make sure that potential differences in drug exposure, response, and device performance are considered. What we also need to make sure is, as you put that plan together, we need to go beyond race and ethnicity. We need to consider other factors that might play a role when it comes to safety and effectiveness, like gender, age, pre-existing conditions. Right. In terms of for drugs, covariates that impact the drug exposure and response, PK, PD, is really important to consider when putting this plan together, because diverse patients might react differently to that. And again, they mentioned the devices, device performance. That's really a point that they're trying to bring home in this diversity guidance. And then we need to make sure that the analysis that we perform is comprehensive to understand the potential differences in treatment effects. So, and as you look at the data, we need to make sure that any existing data that you might want to use that hints at performance differences needs to be considered as part of the study design to make sure that analysis is relevant. We need to make sure that if you're looking at certain race and ethnicity subgroups, we need to ensure that the enrollment speaks to that. So greater than proportional enrollment of specific populations to reveal potential disparities is another key point that I would like to highlight here. And even though the data may not suggest disparities, disease prevalence through diverse enrollment is something that's also very worth mentioning here. And then pooling the data to ensure that the analysis later on down the line can be determined, can help determine the outcome by race and ethnicity. What we also need to make sure is that we talk about lifelong diversity. That means that if you need to make sure that you track potential safety and effectiveness differences by race and ethnicity throughout the product development, not just in pivotal trials, right? And the enrollment goals should be based on disease prevalence in those diverse populations. And we need to make sure that that available data sources, like scientific journals, published literature, real-world data, RWD, right? That's another big talking point within the regulatory space right now, that we make use of that to make good decisions around what the goals for should be, and they should be data driven. And then if the data is limited, what we need to make sure is we consider based on enrollment goals on demographics and the overall population. And then, of course, can't forget about the kids. Make sure you include, where applicable, pediatric patients as well. So, what should be part? What are the elements that they recommend should be part of this diversity plan? Overview of the condition, scope, goals for enrollment, specific plan of action to enroll and retain diverse participants. That's actually really interesting. They talk about not just enrolling, but also retain these participants, right? That needs to be considered. We need to make sure we actually get them in the door at the study site, but then also keep them as part of the trial, right? And this is really a two-part effort that needs to be considered. And then obviously the diversity plan also needs to include the some sort of status update of meeting and enrollment goals that needs to be shared. So for the site audience, a couple of key takeaways here. One, review past studies and enrollment data. Identify how you can be an attractive partner for sponsors and find your niche, right? If you look at your past enrollment data for relevant trials, make sure to highlight that and then raise your hand and say that, hey, we can bring XYZ potential patient populations to the table. That's going to be really attractive for sponsors to hear. And then for sponsors, you need to make sure that as part of your site selection process, you include diversity data. You develop plans that contain goals that are actually achievable, and work with sites on managing diverse enrollment. This is a two-way street, and then sites and sponsors I can envision here, or having a closer collaboration. If you already have known sites that where sponsors, you can attract and retain a diverse study population, that's wonderful, right? Keep working on that. But don't forget, there are other sites that might not be part of the initial site selection. Don't forget about those. Make sure you look at what they could bring to the table. So let's move right on to the next guidance that I want to talk about. My favorite, the new 21 CFR Part 11 guidance. So 21 CFR Part 11. This guidance is a Q&A format, and the FDA shared their thinking across 5 categories: electronic records, systems that are owned, controlled by sponsors and other regulated entities, tech providers, digital health technologies, DHTs, and electronic signatures. So let's dive right on in. How do we get here? Part 11, as we all know, was first released, the regulation was released in 1997. I would think that we probably have people on this call that were born after 1997. So welcome to you all. Thank you for being part of this here as well. So this regulation is old as dirt, and it has it's something that has really shaped the clinical trials in the electronic records industry for quite some time. So in 2003 was the first attempt made to kind of help shape industry around what Part 11 means, right, and how it's evolving. And then in 2017 was another Q&A guidance released, and now we are at in 2023. Just last year, they've released the brand new draft guidance. And there are a couple key points that I need to make as part of this discussion. Is one, in 2003, the FDA acknowledged a couple of things. One is that in 2003, the recommendations were narrowly tailored to reflect the current the technology environment that prevailed at the time, right? 2003, we all remember, that was pre-iPhone. That was, laptops were, the size of, I don't know, they were hardly portable. Advances in technology obviously have expanded the uses and capabilities of electronic systems. Updated recommendations regarding the risk-based approach to validation are also included in this new guidance. And it finally includes guidance around IT services, use of DHTs for remote data acquisition. And it really clears up some expectations for sponsors, sites, and tech providers. So something for everyone. So obviously, these 4 elements that are listed in around the Part 11 guidance here: certified copies, use of EHRs, validations of systems, data retention and cloud. Those are key elements of this guidance. And the FDA, this is a quote actually from the FDA from the guidance that says, electronic systems and technologies are used to manage in novel ways, and services are shared or contracted between organizations, and the electronic data flow between systems is more efficient and more prevalent than ever. Right, and the term novel ways really came, really gained popularity within the regulatory circles in around the pandemic, right, where we just try to keep the wheels on the bus as clinical trial infrastructure kind of we're able to utilize this existing clinical trial infrastructure, and we had to reimagine how clinical trials were being run, right? And novel ways is something you see mentioned in ICH E6R3, in the Part 11 guidance. It's just it's all over the place. So let's dive into some of these examples, right? Certified copies. What does that mean? Certified copy can be done through 2 different ways. You can have a dated signature on something, or you can have a validated process in place. So if you use a software system, make sure that the validation to ensure that a copy is created that is an identical document of something, is that the validation documentation supports that. And regulated entities need to maintain certified copy SOPs to make sure that it's clear how certified copies can be created, right? Is it the dated signature process, or is it where someone signs off and says, I certified that this is I test that this is a certified copy, or a validated process that is something that's kind of done by an electronic system sort of automatically, so the dated signature is not needed anymore. And then associated metadata should be included. Who created this certified copy? When was the certified copy created? Next is they talk about real-world data sources, EHRs, in studies. The FDA states that there's no certified copy needed, but it should include the source of the record. Right? For example, a cover sheet by a hospital. And if real-world data is part of the submission, sponsors should ensure the quality and integrity of the data. As for data retention in the cloud, there's finally mentioning around cloud computing and cloud data centers, and cloud computing services for storage of data. We at CRIO, obviously, we have our system in the cloud, right? The FDA finally acknowledged and accepts cloud computing services for storage. They finally called that out. That's wonderful. To prevent data loss, obviously, we need to make sure that the sufficient backup procedures are in place, and the relationship between the records and the source data, metadata, should be preserved in a secure and traceable manner. Right? The FDA needs to be able to see how this data was collected, who collected it, and that needs to be preserved for future inspection or review. In terms of validation of systems, we need to make sure that the validation ensures that the system is correctly performing its intended function, right? It all comes down to risk proportionality, and if there are items that are critical to quality, right? If your system collects endpoint data, you need to make sure that the validation documentation supports that, whether it's validation documentation from the tech vendor or your own validation of the system. And regulated entities, site sponsors, CROs need to review the vendor's SOPs and validation documentation around that. regulated entities also should perform user acceptance testing. And the key element here is should. It's not required. And you can, as an alternative, you could review the vendor's UAT and associated documentation. And if that's found to be adequate, that's also acceptable by the FDA. Again, you just need to document your justification as part of that method. Let's make something very clear. Any system under Part 11 requires validation. And that is something that is really important to point out because I was just at the FDA workshop in DC. I was able to attend in person and last week, and they had some inspection examples. And one of the inspection example was that a sponsor was using an unvalidated the system that was not validated, and the FDA comes in, asks for validation records, and the sponsor had no idea where to find them, and there weren't any. And so that's really, really important to make sure that you have oversight over your vendor and you have validation documentation in place that supports the intended use of the system. And on top of that, if you're using an electronic system, having a strong customer support staff to address any potential questions and issues is key, right? The site, when they start using an electronic system, they're not an IT help desk, right? They didn't go to school and get their degrees to become an IT help desk for sponsors and for patients, right? That's not their job. So we need to make sure that tools are being used that have the associated infrastructure and resources behind it that can have to keep the site focused on the task at hand. And then having internal processes in place to ensure the staff knows how to use the system is key. How to administer users, how to train patients, if patient input is required in the electronic system, all those are key elements of this guidance. So speaking of FDA inspections, what do they focus on in general? Right? But please take this. This is a generic statement that is part of the guidance. Generally, they all focus on the following: training records of site staff, procedures and controls to make sure that the system can be accessed properly, the data creation, data modification, and data maintenance. Right? Who's allowed to make changes to the source data, and how's the data maintained, where is it maintained, and then any documents that are around the use of electronic systems at the site that generate, collect, and transmit and archive data. So those are the focus areas of the FDA according to this Part 11 guidance. So what are the takeaways here? Two takeaways. Pitfall 1 would be lack of oversight of the vendor. You need to make sure that your vendor, whoever you're using here, meets the criteria to manage clinical trial data. And the vendor, any vendor that is worth adding to your clinical trial, then you need to make sure that they can provide you with the associated documentation to meet your Part 11 compliance. Again, validation documentation, resources and guides to make sure that the system can be administered and maintained as expected. Then the pitfall 2 is really the lack of internal process. Make sure you have your internal processes in line with what the systems can do, right? So you need to make sure that if you have a user administration SOP, right? What if someone leaves? What if someone comes on board? What if someone switches studies and uses a different part of the electronic system or a completely different system entirely, right? You need to make sure that your internal processes are in place. Same with UAT, right? How do you demonstrate and how do you procedurally control acceptance of the system, right? And again, any vendor should be able to help you with that if they're working in this space. Next, we're moving on to the DCT guidance. The DCT guidance, as we know, DCTs are a hot topic, just like diversity in clinical trials, right? And just to make sure we set the table here, a decentralized clinical trial is a trial where some or all of the trial-related activity activities occur at locations other than the traditional clinical trial site. And this is straight from the guidance. And by enabling this remote participation, it elevates convenience for clinical trial participants. It can reduce the burden on patients as well as caregivers, and may help facilitate research on rare diseases or diseases affecting populations with limited mobility or not the traditional access to sites that have been used in the past, right? And this may help improve participant engagement, recruitment, enrollment, and retention of a meaningfully diverse clinical trial population, right? So DCT and diversity really work hand in hand here. And that's really the goal of the DCT guidance, is to make sure we can enroll and retain a diverse trial population. It really lower the barriers to clinical trial participation. So what are some of the elements here? We have DCT design, we have remote clinical trial activities, DHTs, the digital health technologies, the roles and responsibilities for sites and sponsors and other regulated entities. They talk about informed consent and IRB oversight, talk about the investigational product, safety monitoring, and software used in DCTs. So lots to unpack here, so we dive right on in. So in and around this concept of decentralized clinical trials, there's 6 key elements as that are part of the guidance, right? They talk about the digital health technologies, telemedicine, local healthcare providers, home visits, electronic informed consent, IP distribution directly to the patients. So the clinical trial protocol for the sponsors on the call here, the clinical trial protocol needs to define what elements of a DCT are being used in a trial. And by definition, if a central lab is used and you run a traditional clinical trial, there's already a decentralized element in place, right? So aren't we all already doing this anyway? So for remote clinical trial visits and trial-related activities, what do we have here? The key word as part of the guidance, reading and interpreting this for you all, is that the key word here is optionality. Visits can take place at the home, and that can be done in person or remote, or that can be done at the local healthcare facility. And that can be, your primary care doctor, for example, instead of having to travel across state lines or across county lines or just across town to visit the clinical trial site, right? You can maybe just go down the road or in your neighborhood visit your primary care provider. And a key element of the guidance is that the variability and precision of the data obtained in the DCT may differ from the data in a traditional site-based clinical trial. And the FDA acknowledges that, and assessments may differ if they're performed outside of the clinical trial site, and that may have an impact on data management and analysis. And that's something that the FDA points out. Is that a quote from the guidance here. So let's talk about the local healthcare providers, HCPs. The FDA, in their opinion, says that activities that do not require protocol-specific knowledge can be performed by a local healthcare provider. And trial-related activities that are unique to the protocol and unique to research, and things that, activities that require detailed knowledge of the protocol or the IP, should be performed by qualified trial personnel who have been appropriately trained, right? And local HCPs are not considered investigators, so they don't need to be on the 1572. Instead, we have a new form that is proposed, that's the task log. DHTs. Sponsors, you need to make sure that if the digital health technologies are used, they are suitable for all participants to prevent exclusion, right? Again, the whole idea of increasing diversity in clinical trials is to make sure that as many people, make the funnel as wide as possible, right? Make sure as many people as possible can be included. And obviously that is to increase participation and retention in the clinical trial. And you can think of things that, if you say, okay, bring your own device trials. Traditional challenges have been, if you work with a population, let's say in a country or even in a part of the country that may not have the latest smartphone, right? How can you make sure that these potential participants may not be excluded? Right. So those are things that are obviously, it's a very simple example, and obviously one possible solution there would be a sponsor provision DHTs, right? Obviously that then comes with additional overhead and management of those digital health tools, but digital health technologies. But that's just one way to go about that. And obviously there's way more information than available in the DHT draft guidance that came out in 2021, and I've got a link down below there as well. So for sponsors, what are your responsibilities? And the same, there's no difference really in terms of responsibilities, whether you talk about a traditional site trial or DCT or hybrid. Right? The data management plan and the data monitoring plan must account for multiple sources of data collection. Again, there's going to be there may be variability in the data that's collected, right? And the data management plan, the monitoring plans need to account for that. And you should have a risk-based approach in place to monitor the data that's collected in DCTs. And the type and scope of QC measures should be tailored to the criticality of the data. Again, if you're collecting endpoint data remotely, you need to make sure you have procedures in place that account for the monitoring of this of these critical to quality data points. For investigators on the line, investigators, you are responsible for oversight and conduct of the DCT, and you need to determine whether or not additional training is required when it comes to video conferencing technology, e-consent, or any remote data collection, right? Imagine a sensor is being used, right? You need to make sure that this training for the sensor is being done. And any delegation of trial-related activities, if you include local healthcare providers, things like performing physical exams, reading, obtaining vital signs, or reading radiographs, those are things that if they're delegated out, you need to make sure that this is part of the study protocol that's really defined there. So let's talk about the most controversial thing of the DCT guidance, the task log and the 1572. I say that's controversial because the feedback that the FDA has received in and around this has been emotionally charged, I would say, because we have the 1572 and then this new form, the task log, right? So if you contribute directly and significantly to the trial data, you should be on the 1572 as sub-investigators. Local healthcare providers, as defined in the draft guidance, should not be listed on the 1572 as sub-Is. But local HCPs should be in the task log, right? And that should include the names and affiliations of the local HCPs, descriptions of roles and assigned tasks, dates that the HCPs are added to the log, and locations where these activities are conducted. So in theory, that means quite a bit of more, just another form to manage, another form to take care of. So that's something that will be interesting to that development will be really interesting to follow as they continue to refine this draft guidance and see where it stands. More on that later. So next, shipment of investigational product. That is obviously something that needs to be carefully considered in a clinical trial that includes decentralized elements. Why? Because IP administration of IP outside the clinical trial site is something that needs to be carefully considered because we need to consider the complexity of the administration, the safety profile of the drug, and also the stability of the drug. Right? If we ship a refrigerated box to a patient, how do we know they can maintain the stability of the IP as they have in their home? And how do they store it, right? How do they keep it safe from others? Those type of things. And we need to make sure that the protocol identifies how the physical integrity and stability of the IP will be maintained during shipment, and then obviously how it's tracked and how it's the method of how it's being shipped. If the IP is sent directly to trial participants, how do we track and make sure it actually gets to the right person, right? This is not just some random FedEx or UPS box that you can drop off, right? This is if it's a depending on the safety profile of the drug, right? You need to make sure you hand that to the patient that actually needs it, right? And that person needs to then obviously be trained on how to administer the IP. So those are all factors that kind of play a role here. And of course, lastly, the last bullet here, procedures regarding the disposal of unused IP and the documentation around that needs to be clear. And do the patient, bring it back into the clinic, right? Where do they drop it off? Do they mail it back? All those type of things need to be part of the discussion. Safety monitoring. Safety monitoring is really important when it comes to DCTs because it introduces additional challenges, right? Well, how do you document an adverse event if you are at your local healthcare provider and something goes awry? How do I address adverse events, right? Who to reach out to, and those type of elements need to be defined. And then in terms of safety monitoring, how do when and how to conduct telehealth versus in-person visits for safety monitoring, that needs to be defined. And we need to consider if local HCPs can be used to collect safety data. And let's say a DHT is being used, how to respond to an abnormal alert, right? What if you are wearing a sensor on your arm, right? And it just, the low battery status, starts blinking, and then, does the patient know what that is, what that means, right? Is there some error? Is there something wrong with me? All those things need to be defined, right? To make sure that something doesn't go awry. And speaking of sensors and DHTs, let's dive into some of the DCT software elements. We have software and apps that are obviously part of digital health technologies. We have telemedicine, IP tracking, trial scheduling tools, electronic informed consent, eCRF, eSource, direct data capture. Those are all elements that are part of the DCT guidance. We talk about DCT, that they're all under the DCT software umbrella. So in terms of software being used, training should be provided to all parties that use the software, right? That includes investigators, site staff, trial participants, and if applicable, local healthcare providers, right? And software tools that are used to produce and process trial records are subject to Part 11. Video interactions like telehealth are not considered electronic records, even though they are performed in the electronic format, right? They're not considered electronic records and are not subject to Part 11. So with all this being said, what's the takeaway of the DCT guidance? This guidance helps investigators, sponsors, site staff consider the implications of removing some or all of the interactions of a traditional site-based trial. And it might appear daunting, But when those tools are used properly, they can really alleviate the patient burden and foster a more inclusive environment for clinical trial participation. That's really the key takeaway here, and that's the intent of the FDA, right? To say to open this funnel wide open to say, okay, what tools can we encourage that are being used by sponsors, by sites, by investigators, to make sure that we include as many people as possible in a clinical trial. Some questions that are obviously still just to kind of get you thinking about some of these things is how do we manage the task log versus the 1572? That was a big ticket item in the feedback in the feedback section of the FDA draft guidance, where you can submit comments on FDA.gov. How are data captured during a visit to the local healthcare provider? Do they have access to some electronic system? Is the patient walking in with paper charts? Right? What do we do here? How's training provided to local healthcare providers? Should local healthcare providers be aware of the protocol at all? If I take vital signs, and let's say I have elevated blood pressure, is there something? Wouldn't you think that a healthcare provider should know what kind of acceptable ranges are for blood pressure, for example? Again, just something to think about here. Obviously, from the investigator standpoint, the question is, with all these different tools and stakeholders involved, how can the investigator demonstrate and maintain oversight? That's really important. And different data from different sources, what does that mean in terms of how does that affect monitoring and in terms of data management, monitoring and safety monitoring, those type of things. And if they're treated differently, how are they treated differently? So those are all questions that people in the industry, including myself, have that we send that back to the FDA, because that's something that we obviously would like more guidance on. So next is the EU-US data privacy framework that I quickly want to touch on. The EU-US data privacy framework is something that it's been a long time coming. Many attempts have been made to figure out a process that allows safe data collection, data transfer across the borders, especially from the EU and the United States. Right? We had the EU Data Protection Directive in '95, Safe Harbor, Privacy Shield, and obviously Privacy Shield was in place until the middle of 2020, when the famous, infamous Schrems II decision came down from the European Court of Justice that basically shut down the Privacy Shield. And now the latest attempt is the EU-US data privacy framework. Privacy Shield obviously had some issues. Unchecked US surveillance is probably one of the biggest ones. Here, European data remained vulnerable to warrantless access by US intelligence. That obviously is not great. And then there was limited redress. Right, there was ineffective mechanisms were in place to address data privacy concerns for EU citizens. And the new safeguards in the framework obviously puts a curb on US intelligence access, enhanced oversight, and increased accountability, and has an independent redress mechanism in place. So that is something that obviously they looked at what didn't work in the Privacy Shield. Okay, let's tighten up our procedures and our oversight to make sure we can address some of the concerns by EU citizens. So if people that work in the privacy space, in the data protection space, they ask, oh, what about standard contractual clauses? And is that something that we've had in the past? Yes. Standard contractual clauses are, for the folks on the webinar that don't know what they are, that they're pre-approved clauses by the EU that allow to, it's basically a contract that you can put in place that allows transfers to personal data from the EU to countries outside of the EU that do not have adequate data protection laws. Right, and as Privacy Shield was invalidated, SCC, standard contractual clauses, became kind of the central mechanism on how international data transfers were allowed by the regulators. So the question then is, okay, you have SCCs, standard contractual clauses that have been in place, or the DPF, the new data privacy framework certification. Now, both are acceptable. And U.S. companies, you can certify, you can self-certify by committing to comply with a detailed set of privacy obligations, and the certification includes a self-certification questionnaire on the Department of Commerce website, and then upon completion review by the Department of Commerce, a certificate of self-certification is issued to you, and then you can say, okay, we have self-certified against the data privacy framework. We don't need to have standard contractual clauses in place. The question is, right, as if you go back to the timeline slide, right, we had all these different things trying to, all these different attempts were being made to kind of ensure that we have safe international data transfers. The biggest question is, will it fare better than Safe Harbor or Privacy Shield? And obviously, as you can imagine, since this came out in July of 2023, people are in August of 2023, right? People are already banging on the door at the European Court of Justice and saying, well, this is not working out, this is still falling short of adequate protection, you name it. And what's something really important to keep in mind is that the legal challenge to the Privacy Shield was put in play, it was first filed in 2018, and Privacy Shield, because it made its way through the courts, remained intact until it was struck down by the courts in 2020. So the question is, whether we should do it. It's really up to you, obviously, but for now, I would think it's probably if you are someone that processes EU data, if you have SCCs in place, that's wonderful. But I think it would not hurt to also self-certify against the EU-US data privacy framework. I think it's just a good thing to have in place. For companies that work with vendors, right? You need to make sure you have SCCs in place with US organizations that process data, or you need to ask them about their DPF certification. So with just a few minutes left, I want to quickly touch on an outlook on what to expect in 2024. Three things I'm kind of keeping my eye on personally is we have the draft guidance in a document on the collection and analysis of disaggregated data in clinical trials. That draft guidance is out of Canada. In the UK, we have the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, and ICH E6 R3, obviously, the adoption of the technical document, which is the principles and Annex 1, and final consensus on Annex 2 is also something I keep close watch on for 2024. All of these items are part of the handout, so feel free to peruse those. ICH E6 is an easy read, so just roughly 100 pages. So can't sleep at night, feel free to peruse that. If you have any questions about anything that we've discussed today, feel free to reach out. Obviously, we have a few minutes left for some Q&A. I'm just going to take a quick gander here. Aisha, if we want to take some questions, happy to do so now.
Absolutely. So Mark, thank you very much for that very wonderful, very insightful, very important presentation around regulations, and definitely the audience got a lot from all of your insights. So thank you so much for that. So yes, let's go right into the Q&A. We do have a couple of minutes for some questions. All right, so let's start with one of the questions here. So audience members, please continue to send in your questions and we'll try to attend to them. If we can't, the team at CRIO may follow up with you after the webinar. So, all right, so I'm gonna go right ahead with a question that we have here. And Mark, this question is asking, in regards to diversity, how do you address certain minorities populations that may be historically reported or underrepresented as an affected population? And do you have any comments or recommendations for best practice for including these populations in studies?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, that's obviously on everyone's mind, right? How to kind of increase participation of these certain population groups, and I would strongly lean on academic journals and real world data where we can identify where those populations are, work directly with sites, reach out to sites, and identify if these groups are part of the site's portfolio of patients that they have seen in the past, because past action obviously indicates future action, not necessarily, but that would be probably the best place to start. I would encourage looking at real world data, in scientific literature, to start there, and then also closely work with sites and other stakeholder groups and expert groups. Would be organizations like the Association for Diversity in Clinical Trials. Yeah, that's something that comes to mind. That would be another great resource for you to contact if you have any specific diversity goals in mind.
Thank you for that answer. The next question that we have here is, you mentioned that persons that are delegated tasks that do not require sponsor-specific training to perform do not need to be listed on the DOA log. Would you advise the sponsor to only include tasks that require sponsor training to perform on the DOA log? What form, if any, should be used to document whom is delegated tasks that do not require sponsor training to perform?
Correct. So with that, I would make sure that the protocol spells out activities that don't require protocol-specific knowledge need to be outlined, and those are the tasks that can be performed by others that don't require the sponsor-specific training. And I would, if the FDA actually encourages people reaching out to them and asking about it, and regulators always get a bad rep. I can tell you from first-hand experience, regulators actually encourage people reaching out to them. And if you have any specific questions about, hey, should I include this? Here's let's say here's a draft protocol, or here's a past protocol, and I want to design a new trial that with similar elements, but then we want to designate this as activities that might not require protocol-specific knowledge or sponsor training, right? Can we use that? And the FDA will likely give you feedback. So I encourage, reach out to your regulators, not just the FDA. If you're in Europe, reach out to the EMA. But that's something that I would strongly encourage you do.
Thank you very much for those answers, Mark. We've now reached the end of the Q&A portion of the webinar and the webinar itself. So I'd like to thank once again our audience for your attendance, and for those who are interested in learning more from CRIO, you can register for their next webinar, which is entitled Clinical Trial Sites, the Rise of the Mega Network, which is scheduled for Wednesday, April the 10th 2024, using the link that I've sent in the chat box. And as well, if we couldn't attend to your questions during the Q&A session, the team at CRIO, as I mentioned, may follow up with you, or if you have any further questions, you can direct them to the email address displayed on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve on our webinars. Additionally, I'm going to share another link in the chat box where you will be able to view the recording of today's event. And I know that a lot of our audience members were asking about that. So that should be sent to you within the next 2 days, or the recording will be made available at that link in the next 2 days. You can also share this link with your colleagues so that when they register, they can also view the recording. So I do encourage you to do so. Now, please join us in thanking once again our speaker for today, Marc Wartenberger, for his time and insights. We hope you found this webinar informative. On behalf of the team here at XTalks, thank you once again for your attendance and your time. And until next time, have a great day, everyone. Thank you once again, Marc.
Thank you.